This short video is going to provide a very brief explanation of the decision in the leading case of Salomon and Salomon and Company Limited. So I've already discussed the facts of this case in another video, and in yet another video I discussed the issues that were presented before the court. So in short, the two issues that the court had to decide were, firstly, whether or not the company was a sham, that is, was it really a company, or was Mr. Salomon just trying to hide behind something called a company and which was not really a company? Because if you recall from the facts, the other family members, that is Mr. Salomon's wife and his 5 children, were only shareholders up to the extent of 6 shares. That is, each of them was holding just 1 share in the company, and all of the remaining shares were held all alone by Mr. Salomon himself. So the argument was that this was essentially nothing different from being a sole trader, the way Mr. Salomon's business was operating as a sole trading business before he formed this company. Why? Because previously also he owned the sole trading business all alone, that is, he was the only owner of that business, and now what he had done was that he created a company and he was the majority. In fact, you can say to a certain extent he was holding all of the shares, almost all of the shares in this new company, and the question was whether or not this company can be called a true company, or was it just a sham? So I've already explained in that other video what a sham means. So if you're not clear about the facts, please revisit that video. For now, I'm just going to move on to the second issue. So the second issue before the court was whether Mr. Salomon should or should not be held personally liable for the company's debts, because if you remember, once again, the company was now going into liquidation. And in part 2, that is the part before this one, I have also explained already that these two issues are interlinked. Why? Because the answer to the first issue is going to determine the answer to the second issue. In other words, if the company is held to be a sham, that is, if the court decides that the company is indeed a sham, then in that case, obviously, Mr. Salomon will indeed be held liable for the debts of the company personally. Why? Because this so-called company is not going to be considered as a company in the true sense of the word. However, if the court decides in answer to the first issue that the company is not a sham, then obviously Mr. Salomon is not going to be held personally liable. So let us very quickly look at what the court decided. Now, first of all, let me clarify, as you can see in the slides, that is the lecture slides that I have provided, and also in this particular picture where I have written the summary in short. So you can see that there are 2 words that should stand out. First is the Court of Appeal, and second is the House of Lords. And if you're studying this case only for the purposes of understanding the decision, then remember that this point is not important. However, just to let you know, the Court of Appeal is basically the High Court. That is, for example, in Pakistan or in India we have the High Courts. Similarly, in the UK, the High Court is considered as the or you can say it is termed as the Court of Appeal. And again, the House of Lords is what we know here as the Supreme Court. So the House of Lords at that time, as it was called, because even now in the UK it's called the Supreme Court and not the House of Lords anymore. But at that point in time, when this case came before the courts at that time, so in short, the Court of Appeal is simply the High Court. That is the court to which the case goes after the case has been decided by the first trial court, that is the district court, you can say. And then from the Court of Appeal, that is the High Court, the case goes on to the Supreme Court, that is the highest, which we call as the apex court, the highest court, after which there is no appeal. So the House of Lords is simply the Supreme Court. Okay, so now that that bit is clear, and once again I repeat that this information is not relevant if you're studying the case only in order to understand the decision in this case, that is the principle that was held in this case and which set the precedent for other cases in the future that came before the court. But what is really important is the principle itself. So let's move on to discuss that right away. Okay, first of all, please note that the decision of the High Court, that is the Court of Appeal, was that the company was indeed a sham, and that, of course, what leads from that is that Mr. Salomon should be held liable personally for the debts of the company. However, and this is extremely important, this decision itself was then appealed by Mr. Salomon to the House of Lords, that is the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court disagreed with the Court of Appeal and decided that the company was not a sham, and therefore, in answer to the second issue, Mr. Salomon was not personally liable for the company's debts. So what you need to remember from the decision in this case is that the company owns its own debts just like it owns its own assets, and since the company is a separate legal personality, that is, it's recognized as having a separate entity, so therefore once a company has been created properly through the incorporation process, whatever rules exist at that time, for example at that point in time the relevant rule was that you have to have 7 members and so on and so forth, and once Mr. Salomon had complied with all of those rules, so now it was irrelevant that the majority of the shares were held by Mr. Salomon alone and that the family members were only holding the other shares, that is 1 share each, as a mere technicality. So this point was irrelevant, and the court decided that the company was not a sham, it was not a facade behind which Mr. Salomon was trying to hide.